They say the spotlight reveals everything, but some secrets are kept in the whispers shared between friends when the cameras stop rolling. For years, the bond between Kelly Clarkson and Gwen Stefani seemed like a simple Hollywood friendship, built on shared laughs and revolving chairs. But a recent, private conversation has sent shockwaves through their inner circle. What did Kelly reveal to Gwen in a moment of raw honesty, and why are fans now questioning if the foundation of one of country music's most beloved marriages is beginning to crack? To understand the weight of these words, we have to look past the smiles and into the psychological pressure of a life lived in the public eye. They say the spotlight reveals everything, but some secrets are kept in the whispers shared between friends when the cameras stop rolling. For years, the bond between Kelly Clarkson and Gwen Stefani seemed like a simple Hollywood friendship, built on shared laughs and revolving chairs. But a recent, private conversation has sent shockwaves through their inner circle. What did Kelly reveal to Gwen in a moment of raw honesty, and why are fans now questioning if the foundation of one of country music's most beloved marriages is beginning to crack? To understand the weight of these words, we have to look past the smiles and into the psychological pressure of a life lived in the public eye. To the world, Kelly Clarkson is an unbreakable force. We see her on our screens every day, radiating a warmth that feels like a steady hand in a chaotic world. But behind that powerhouse persona is a woman who has spent the last few years navigating an exhausting, uphill climb. Her divorce wasn't just a breakup, it was a public dissection of her personal life, played out in courtrooms and across tabloid headlines. For Kelly, the journey through legal battles and the rebuilding of her own identity wasn't just about moving on, it was about surviving a system that often demands women remain silent and smiling, even when they are breaking inside. Today, Kelly stands as a symbol of resilience, but that strength carries a heavy price. Psychologically, she has moved into a phase of radical honesty. When you have lost as much as she has, you lose the fear of speaking the truth. She is no longer interested in protecting the perfect image that the entertainment industry works so hard to maintain. Between the demands of being a global brand and the quiet, heavy responsibility of being a single mother, Kelly has developed a sharp intuition. She has learned to recognize the subtle masks people wear because she wore one for so long herself. This is where her bond with Gwen Stefani becomes so vital. On the surface, they are opposites, the pop icon from Anaheim and the girl next door from Texas. Yet, they speak a secret language of survival. Their friendship became a safe harbor, a place where the noise of the industry could be muted. Kelly looks at Gwen not just as a co-star, but as a sister-in-arms. However, this deep empathy recently took a complicated turn. Because Kelly has walked through the fire, she has become hyper-aware of the smoke. She began to notice patterns in Gwen's life that felt eerily familiar, triggering a sense of protective urgency she couldn't suppress. Kelly reached a point where staying silent felt like a betrayal of the very friendship she cherished. But as Kelly looked closer at Gwen's life with Blake Shelton, she began to notice a series of familiar signs that she simply could not ignore. What exactly did Kelly see in the quiet moments between the perfect couple that made her feel the need to speak up? Every marriage has its own private rhythm, a quiet song that only two people truly hear. But when that rhythm is broadcast to millions of viewers every week, the pressure to keep the beat becomes immense. For years, Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani were held up as the gold standard of an unlikely but perfect Hollywood romance. He was the charming country king, and she was the effortless pop icon. Together, they created a narrative that felt like a modern fairy tale. However, working in such close proximity on the set of The Voice, Kelly Clarkson began to see past the polished banter and the playful chemistry that the cameras captured so perfectly. Psychologists often talk about the mirror effect, where a person who has experienced a specific trauma becomes hypersensitive to the same signs in others. Because Kelly had recently navigated the collapse of her own long-term partnership, her intuition was sharpened to a razor's edge. She wasn't looking for drama, but she couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in Gwen's energy during long days of filming. It wasn't about a single explosive argument or a visible fallout. Instead, it was a collection of small, quiet moments, a lingering look of exhaustion, a joke from Blake that landed a little too sharply, or a smile from Gwen that didn't quite reach her eyes once the on-air light went dark. Kelly understood the psychological toll of performing a relationship. When the public demands a fairy tale, the truth often gets buried deep under the script. She saw Gwen navigating the same delicate balance she once had, trying to be the supportive partner while slowly losing pieces of her own identity to the overwhelming persona of the couple. Kelly watched as Blake's public persona, the happy-go-lucky, teasing husband, seemed to clash with the more complex, perhaps more difficult, realities of their private life. It was a mirror of Kelly's own past, and it filled her with a sense of growing dread. This emotional intuition is what separates a colleague from a true friend. Kelly knew that if she saw these shadows, Gwen was living them. She recognized the specific kind of loneliness that exists even when you are standing next to the person you love in front of a cheering crowd. She knew that the more the world insisted they were perfect, the harder it would be for Gwen to admit if they weren't. These quiet observations weighed heavily on Kelly's heart for months. She agonized over whether to speak up or stay in her lane, knowing that intervening in a marriage is the most dangerous move a friend can make. Ultimately, her love for Gwen outweighed her fear of the fallout. These observations eventually led to an invitation for a private dinner, a night where the stage lights were off, the microphones were put away, and the masks finally came off. It was during this dinner that a revelation would occur, one that would change their friendship forever and set a new, uncertain course for everyone involved. The atmosphere shifted the night Kelly finally decided to break her silence. This wasn't a calculated move for headlines or a plot for a tabloid story, it was a moment of raw, emotional vulnerability between two women who had spent years protecting their hearts from the public eye. Over a quiet dinner, away from the glitz of the studio, Kelly shared her truth with Gwen. She didn't start with accusations or gossip. Instead, she spoke from the perspective of someone who had recently walked through the wreckage of a perfect life. She spoke about the quiet, dangerous erosion of identity that happens within a high-profile partnership, the destruction of self that occurs when you spend more energy maintaining a public image than nurturing your private reality. Kelly's words were heavy with the weight of her own experience. She described the psychological exhaustion of playing a part and the slow, agonizing way a person can disappear into the shadow of a famous spouse. It takes immense psychological courage to tell a friend something you know they aren't ready to hear. Kelly wasn't attacking Blake, she was pointing out the patterns of a lifestyle that eventually consumes the people caught within it. She saw the familiar flicker of doubt in Gwen's eyes, the same doubt she had once suppressed in herself. The air in the room felt thick as Kelly laid out the reality of the glittering cage, where the praise of millions can actually make you feel more isolated than ever before. As Kelly spoke, the silence from Gwen was profound. For the first time, Gwen was forced to look at her marriage through a lens she had been carefully avoiding. It was a lens that stripped away the charming social media posts and the playful stage banter, leaving only the stark reality of their day-to-day connection. Kelly's warning wasn't just about a relationship, it was a plea for Gwen to protect her own soul before it was too late. The emotional stakes had never been higher, and the psychological boundary between being a supportive friend and an intrusive outsider had been crossed. The weight of Kelly's words hung in the air long after the dinner ended, vibrating with an intensity that neither woman could easily dismiss. Kelly had expected tears, or perhaps a defensive explanation of why things were different for Gwen and Blake. But Gwen's actual reaction was not what Kelly expected at all. It led to a sudden, freezing period of silence between the two stars, a void that spoke much louder than any public statement or social media post ever could. In the high-stakes world of celebrity, a private conversation is rarely a silent one. Whispers move like wildfire, jumping from inner circles to production assistants, until the air itself feels heavy with unspoken tension. News of Kelly's warning eventually reached Blake Shelton, and the psychological impact was immediate. For a man whose entire public identity is built on being the easygoing, charming, good old boy, the idea that a close colleague was dissecting the stability of his home life was a profound blow to his pride. Blake has spent years cultivating an image of effortless happiness, and having that image questioned by someone who knows him well felt like a breach of the unwritten code of Hollywood family. Behind the scenes of their shared professional projects, the atmosphere shifted from playful to clinical. The jokes felt forced, and the long silences between takes were filled with a new kind of static. Blake found himself in a defensive psychological state, perhaps wondering if Kelly's insights were a reflection of his own shortcomings or merely a projection of her own past pain. Meanwhile, Gwen was caught in the middle of a classic loyalty bind, a deeply stressful emotional position where she felt torn between a friend who had survived the fire and the husband she had chosen to build a life with. To agree with Kelly felt like a betrayal of Blake, but to ignore her felt like a betrayal of her own intuition. This shocking truth that Kelly had shared wasn't a scandal in the sense of a hidden affair or a financial secret, it was something much more profound. It was a realization about the psychological cost of maintaining a public-facing marriage. Gwen began to feel the weight of having to protect Blake's ego while also honoring the concerns of a friend who truly cared for her. The stress of this dual loyalty began to take a physical and emotional toll, showing up in the way she interacted with both Kelly and Blake when the cameras weren't watching. The three stars were now locked in a silent tug-of-war. The professional world they shared was becoming a minefield of hurt feelings and protective walls. With tensions rising and the voice-family dynamic fractured, a critical decision had to be made. Would they choose to address the issue head-on in a moment of potentially explosive honesty, or would they let the resentment simmer in the dark until it eventually boiled over? The world of country music is often built on the foundation of traditional values and the image of the unshakable home. In this landscape, Blake Shelton is more than just a singer, he is an institution. For Gwen Stefani, an outsider who rose to fame in the rebellious world of ska and pop, entering this royalty required a massive psychological shift. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was marrying into a culture with specific expectations of what a wife should be and how a marriage should look. Kelly's intervention acted as a mirror, highlighting the cultural and psychological gaps that still existed between Gwen's true self and the role she was now expected to play as the queen of a country empire. Central to this struggle is the concept of performance fatigue. Psychologically, this is the deep, soul-level exhaustion that comes from having to show the world a face of pure happiness every single day. When your brand is built on being a perfect couple, you lose the right to have a bad day or a private disagreement. Kelly began to notice the telltale signs of this fatigue in Gwen, the way her shoulders dropped when she thought no one was looking, and the effort it took to summon that famous, radiant smile for the cameras. Kelly's own silence was finally broken, not through a loud statement, but through subtle, cryptic shifts in how she interacted with the couple publicly. The nuance of their changing body language became a subject of quiet fascination for those behind the scenes. In promotional photos, they still stood together, but the psychological distance was growing. There was a stiffness where there used to be ease, and a lack of the spontaneous touch that had once defined Gwen and Blake's chemistry. Kelly, meanwhile, began to distance herself from the happy family narrative, her social media posts becoming more focused on individual strength and personal truth rather than the shared projects they had once championed together. This subtle distancing was a quiet siren, warning those in the know that the foundation was shifting. The psychological pressure of keeping up appearances was reaching a breaking point for all three stars. But as the public began to notice these tiny cracks in the facade, a third party suddenly entered the narrative, an unexpected figure whose involvement threatened to turn Kelly's private, heartfelt warning into a very public, very messy problem. Gwen Stefani found herself standing at a psychological crossroads she never expected to revisit. For weeks, the echoes of Kelly's warning played on a loop in her mind, forcing her to do the one thing she feared most, confront the reality of her own internal world. This wasn't just about a marriage, it was a deep dive into Gwen's own history of high-profile heartbreaks. Having survived a very public dissolution of her previous long-term relationship, Gwen had built her life with Blake as a fortress of new beginnings. But now, that fortress felt less like a sanctuary and more like a set where she was the lead actress. The core psychological struggle Gwen faced was the battle between gaslighting and intuition. When the entire world, fans, media, and even your own social circle, constantly tells you that you have the perfect life, it becomes incredibly difficult to trust your own gut feelings. If she felt a flicker of unhappiness or a sense of losing herself, was it a real problem, or was she just sabotaging a good thing? Gwen had to decide if Kelly was merely projecting her own past divorce trauma onto Gwen's present, or if Kelly was actually the only person in her life brave enough to tell her the unvarnished truth. Kelly's words acted as a powerful catalyst, pushing Gwen to reassess the boundaries of her marriage. She began to look at her needs for independence, the Gwen that existed before the country music royalty narrative took over. She started to realize that in her effort to be the perfect partner for Blake, she had silenced the parts of herself that once stood alone and strong. The psychological weight of this realization was immense, leading to sleepless nights and a quiet withdrawal from the public eye. However, just as Gwen reached a hard-won moment of clarity and was prepared to speak her truth to Blake, the situation shifted. A new, unexpected report surfaced in the media, one that didn't come from their camp, and it seemed to confirm Kelly's darkest warnings in a way that no one could ignore. The narrative reaches a quiet but intense climax as Kelly, Gwen, and Blake are finally forced to navigate the fallout of these revealed truths. In the world of high-stakes celebrity, one might expect a dramatic, explosive confrontation caught by paparazzi cameras. Instead, the reality was a series of hushed, difficult conversations behind closed doors. This chapter explores the complex power dynamics of a three-way emotional standoff. Kelly Clarkson stood firmly by her words, exhibiting a rare psychological maturity. She realized that her role as a genuine friend was far more important than maintaining the comfortable status quo of being a celebrity peer. For Kelly, the risk of losing a professional connection was a small price to pay for the chance to save a friend's sense of self. Blake, meanwhile, was forced into a period of deep introspection. He had to address the ways the country music industry, and the perfect husband brand, had shaped his personal life, perhaps at the expense of his partner's happiness. It was a moment of ego-stripping honesty. We see a significant emotional evolution in Gwen during these weeks. She worked to find a middle ground, a psychological space where she could hold on to her love for her husband while still respecting the uncomfortable honesty Kelly had provided. She stopped trying to silence her own intuition and began to advocate for her own space within the marriage. This chapter focuses on the profound psychological growth that can only come from facing uncomfortable truths. The three stars managed to keep the walls of their lives from completely crumbling, but the architecture of their relationships had fundamentally changed. They had moved past the performance and into the messy, complicated reality of human connection. The shocking truth hadn't destroyed them, but it had stripped away the illusions they had all been living under. The resolution of these conversations brought a sense of peace, but it was a fragile one. It left one major, lingering question for fans and insiders alike: can a marriage truly survive and thrive once its deepest flaws have been so clearly pointed out by an outsider? Or does that level of honesty create a crack that no amount of public affection can ever truly fill?